On the screen now, where Trevor Phillips was going to be here in person, but he now claims that he's in Sweden. Personally, I think he's in Hendon, and he's merely got a backdrop. However, what he's going to do is he's going to give the speech that he would have given had he been here, but he's going to do it in the form of a video. So this is Trevor Phillips talking about the power of analytics and transparency.
Good afternoon. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be with you today, but as you know, I'm abroad. I'm sorry that I'm not able to share the, no doubt, very active conversation you've had today. But I've been asked to offer a few thoughts about what I guess has happened since I last joined you, 3 years ago. I want to start by quoting the American writer Thomas Pynchon, who wrote now nearly half a century ago in his novel Gravity's Rainbow the following sentence. If you can get them asking the wrong questions, then the answers don't matter very much. It strikes me that those of us who have been worried about culture, diversity and inclusion over the last couple of decades, though we might have been asking the right questions for a good part of that time, may now be asking ourselves the wrong questions. In particular, I guess we have focused very forcibly on the question of employment proportions. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that everybody is now coming round to the point of view that diversity isn't just a matter of painting by numbers. It is also about culture. It is also about range of experience. It is also about getting the right people round the table. And though diversity of ethnicity or gender, sexual orientation, disability are good pointers to that particular characteristic, they aren't the whole story. That's one example of perhaps where we might have got ourselves stuck, perhaps repeating the thought that we've been having for over a couple of decades. But what I really want to focus on is perhaps a bigger change that's landed on us. More than anything else happening in the world today, the digital universe is changing the way that we need to think about these issues. The center of that is the fact that we have more information available to us about what is going on than ever before. We're able to gain insights about the way that people behave that we just had to guess at 10 or 15 years ago. And I want to talk a little bit about some of that. But we focused, for example, when I was at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, a great deal on employment. What we now know is that perhaps some of the differences in behavior by gender and by ethnicity are to do not with who is employed, but how, for example, if you're a company, how your consumers behave. And I'll give you an example of some of the work that we've done in our data analytics company, Phillips. We did some work for a big shopping center. We were studying the effects of what you might call ethnically inspired promotions around Chinese New Year, around Diwali, and so on. The striking thing about these events is that they promoted extra footfall, in the case of Chinese New Year, an increased footfall of something like 6 or 7%, which is what most retailers dream of year on year, and like-for-like sales increased by 17%. The interesting thing about this is that this could not possibly be accounted for by an influx of Chinese customers. There just aren't enough of them. So what we had to conclude is that something had changed in the behavior of majority consumers, white consumers. The point here being that the promotion, the change in the branding of that particular shopping center for that 2-week period, which is when we were studying it, didn't just say something to minority consumers, it said something to majority consumer. What we think is, it said, this is a modern place. This is a place that if you are younger, you want to see what the new world looks like, come to us. The point I'm really making here is that our insights gained from big data, from better analytical techniques, is telling us some new things about diversity and inclusion, which those of us who've been involved in it professionally for a long time, I think may not quite have caught up with. It means that we perhaps need to examine some of the assumptions that we make. So, for example, there are a couple of things which are now being said which I think perhaps take us down the wrong path. One is, for example, that what we really need to focus on is social mobility. And if we fix that problem, then actually everything else will go away with it. Well, actually, I don't think that's at all the case. When I was chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, one of the things that I found, and also when I was chair of the CRE before that, was that particularly when it came to race, the people who were most hurt, bewildered, fed up about the way they were treated were not young black men being stopped and searched by the police. People who would come into the office and weep, tears, genuine tears, were senior lawyers who had proved themselves in the courtroom and knew that they would never, in spite of that, become QCs. Senior lecturers who knew that they would never become department heads or professors. Long-time teachers who had given up any hope of becoming headmasters or head teachers. Now, I think the point I'm making here is that social mobility may help some people, may make some things change, but actually won't be the answer. The issues of ethnicity, of gender particularly, operate independently to a large extent of that issue. So what do we really need to focus on? Well, I think some of the new stories that are emerging over the last 6 months point us in the right direction. Let me take you to Silicon Valley. In my work in the United States, where I'm chair of the Center for Talent Innovation, we've been doing a lot of work on the culture of tech companies. I don't need to go over the Google story to say that this is something of great concern out in California. 2 years ago, when Google became the first company to publish its statistics by gender and by ethnicity, it sent a shockwave through the state and through the industry. What we saw were numbers that told us that that industry really hadn't caught up with today's demographics in America. Large numbers of young white men, substantial numbers of young Asian Americans, but relatively few women in the areas where it matters, engineering, for example, and almost no blacks and Hispanics. Now, that sent a shockwave, as I say, through California. But what became even more pressing over this last few months has been a revelation of the culture that that has created. We've seen what has now become known as a Damore memo from a Google engineer, which essentially argued that women didn't really belong in the tech sector because their minds weren't up to it. Why was this shocking? Well, it wasn't shocking because there was an odd bloke somewhere in the engineering department. It was shocking because it became clear that this is what most people in the industry believe. What is more important, we've seen the Harvey Weinstein situation emerging, and that, of course, is a scandal, but in some senses it's a familiar Hollywood-type scandal. There's a very bad boy somewhere in the business. The thing that is important in the tech sector is this. Given the way that that sector creates value, they employ relatively few people. Google, for example, or Facebook are companies that have a similar value to, let's say, General Motors. The thing that is different is that they don't employ 500,000 people. They will employ maximum 100,000, which means that each of those employees is incredibly valuable. Valuable employees tend to get a free pass to behave in the way they want to. It's one thing if you have one Harvey Weinstein or one Travis Kalanick. We did the investigation into Uber in our company, by the way, so we saw what was happening inside that company. But if you've got one of those guys, you can get rid of him. You can review, you can investigate, you can change the culture of whistleblowing and speaking up. The problem that the tech sector out in California is now confronting is something that I suspect may afflict other industries, and that is that a third of their employees are potential Travis Kalanicks or potential Harvey Weinsteins. They are so valuable that nobody wants to interfere with their behaviors. The problem that we are now seeing emerging in some of the most modern industries is that there are large numbers of people who are so valuable that you don't want to interfere with their behaviors. I think for everybody who's involved in the sort of work that we do, this is presenting an entirely new challenge. It's not a case of finding the one erring person. It is a case of thinking, how do we change the entire organizational culture of a company or indeed a sector? Well, of course, the big aid in all of this now is transparency. It's now said in some parts of the United States that companies today are like glass boxes. They have their mission statements up in the lobby. They will tell you through their letters from CEOs and chairs and so on what their values are. But the truth is, today, we can see what they're really like because social media posts tell us from the inside, because whistleblowers come out publicly, and because actually we can look at their annual reports and we can see data about who's where, and that tells us a great deal about who they are. It's not an accident that the Uber problem emerged when it did. We were asked to do the investigation into the sentiment within Uber, and of course, because that's commercially privileged, I can't say too much about it. But what I can tell you is that what people thought was going on in Uber was exactly what is going on in Uber and worse. In practice, what the consumer suspected and what put people off using that company actually turned out to be true. My point here is, as the Prime Minister has recently said after the race disparity audit, today there is nowhere to hide for companies. And this tells us an important set of things about the way that we need to behave and the way that we need to be thinking about diversity and inclusion. First of all, having the right proportions of people in your workforce isn't going to be enough. Secondly, telling people what you intend to do is far from enough. And in fact, what we now know is that the gap between the promise and the reality can in itself be damaging. So I think in the next phase, one of the most important things that we're all going to have to face is, how do we bridge that gap? Companies say they want to do X or Y, but actually everybody will be able to see that they're actually doing Z. So I think a big challenge for the diversity and inclusion business is trying to make sure that our organizations bridge that gap. There are three looming issues that I think are emerging from the flood of data, the capacity to interrogate transactions and so on. First of all, there's anger. This is clear in the United States that there are two great angry tribes. One is black and one is white. Many business leaders have approached us to try to help them work through how we deal with this. And we've developed some tools that have assisted leading businesses to tackle what we call the emerging racial tensions. And some of those have worked pretty successfully. but it's work that's going to continue. Secondly, what I described as the white guy problem in tech isn't just a problem inside the companies. It's affecting the product. It is changing the service. What we now know, for example, is that employment websites constructed by tech companies tend to offer women lower paid, lower status jobs. Big problem? Nobody inside the industry thus far has thought this is such a problem. Last year, I found that every time I went on to my American website, one of the things that was happening was that I was getting advertisements for bail bondsmen. That is to say, in the United States, somebody who will help you pay the bail after you've been arrested. Now, why was I getting that? Well, because the cookies had worked out that I was probably black. And that's what you get if you're black, because that's what the tech people think. Now, my point here is we're going to have to deal with all of that. And the third and most tricky thing, I think, that's going to affect people on both sides of the Atlantic is a really, really difficult issue, and that is the re-emergence, or let's say the persistence, of faith and belief. We talk a lot about jihadis and so on, but actually I think there's a deeper issue that's going to confront everybody. In this country, if you look at ONS statistics, the majority population do not go to church every week, about 10% or less. If you look at minority populations, Muslims, African Christians, Caribbean Christians, and so on, they are a third or 50% likely to go to a place of worship every single week. This matters. It is a different view of the world. I encountered it when trying to deal with the issues to do with sexual orientation when I was chair of the EHRC. Not something remarked upon, but the strongest proponents, let's put it this way, of what we would describe as homophobic behavior, the registrars who would not register civil marriages and so on, tended to be people from a minority background who were strong, active Christians. Now, I knew where I stood on that, and the law is pretty clear. But over time, I think all of us who operate within workplaces are going to have to come to terms with the fact that there are very different points of view, and we are going to have to make some decisions about what is permissible and what is not permissible in the workplace. And not all of it can be decided in the courts. Some of it is going to have to be decided in terms of everyday behavior, everyday norms. These are big challenges, and many of them are being revealed by the new tools that we have emerging from big data. I think there are going to be more. I think this is going to present a huge challenge for everybody who cares about culture and diversity and inclusion. It's a difficult time, but an exciting one. Thank you.